Welcome, budding biologists, to your first set of video notes on Unit 1, Ecology. For this unit, we are going to focus on how ecosystems change over time, the process that change takes, as well as interactions and relationships amongst organisms in different ecosystems. All right, let's make it make sense, shall we? We are going to start by diving into levels of organization. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify and relate different levels from an individual organism all the way up to biosphere. Our goal is to see how these levels interact with each other and with the system as a whole. Now, for this unit, we'll focus on macro levels of organization, which involves larger scale interactions. Later on, we'll circle back to explore micro levels, which deal with smaller scale interactions. So again, for Unit 1, you're responsible for understanding levels of organization, beginning with organism, all the way up to biosphere. Later on in the year, we'll come back and do our smaller scale interactions, starting with atom and molecule and going up to organism. But for now, just focus on organism to biosphere, please. All right, here I've given you a forest ecosystem. It's a great example to help us understand these levels. So we'll start down here with our most basic level of organization. And here we have an individual organism. So that is going to be one living being, one plant, one animal, one single bacteria on an agar plate. One living being is going to be an organism or an individual. These organisms make up populations of the same species. These populations come together to form communities. So going back here, we have a single deer, then we have a group of the same species or the same type of deer. That forms a population. And then once we get to community, it's our living beings in a certain area that are interacting with one another. So we have a moose, we have a bobcat, we have an owl, we have a beaver, we have a rabbit. So a community is going to be populations of different organisms, different species coming together. And then moving up from a community, we're going to have our community along with our non-living surroundings, and that's going to create an ecosystem. For this level, we have important vocabulary terms I want to discuss, and that's going to be biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are living components like animals, plants, bacteria, while abiotic factors are non-living elements, such as temperature, sunlight. We have a river flowing through here. So again, an ecosystem is going to be communities along with their non-living surroundings. Similar ecosystems together make up a biome. Examples of biomes would be tropical rainforest, a desert, the savanna. And then finally, we have the biosphere. All the biomes combined form the biosphere. So that's going to be the sum total of all ecosystems on Earth. Please take a moment to pause the video, rewatch if you need to, and ensure you've defined each of the level of organizations in your notes. Now that you feel comfortable with levels of organization, let's move on to ecological succession. We're going to discuss two types, primary and secondary succession. Our aim is to understand the events that occur during each type of succession, the pioneer species involved, and what exactly is a climax community for each. Ecological succession is the process by which ecosystems change and develop over time. So remember, you should be able to differentiate between primary and secondary succession. And I want to point out this on the bottom. Succession focuses on the process of change rather than just the end product. In just a moment, you're going to see that our end product for both is similar. So we're going to focus on the process of change for primary succession and the process of change for secondary. Starting with primary succession. This process starts with bare rock. So primary succession occurs on barren landscapes. Examples of a barren landscape would be a volcanic island, freshly exposed rock from a landfall. It starts where a pioneer species comes in and it's going to colonize the land. So pioneer species is the first species to colonize the land. In primary succession, our pioneer species are going to be mosses and lichens. And the reason mosses and lichens are primary species for primary succession is they actually break down rocks to create soil. That's going to allow small plants to take root. Over time, we'll see small plants such as grasses, then shrubs, and eventually large trees establish. Please notice the diagram here. We start with our pioneer species, and then we have intermediate species, and then eventually we'll end with a climax community. Before we move on to secondary succession, I do want to make a point. I know we're focusing a lot on the plant species that are forming these climax communities. However, as our pioneer species and our intermediate species come in, and we are talking about plants here, animals will be moving in as well. So when moss and lichen are present, you might see a small number of insects move into the area because they can consume those pioneer species. As grass comes in, our organisms that eat grass can now move into the area. As shrubs move in, we'll see more biodiversity. And then as our trees, especially our large trees, develop, we're going to have more and more biodiversity. We might now see deer, rabbits, birds of various kinds as well. So a climax community is going to be a very biodiverse community that consists of both plants and animals. This process can take centuries to millennia, as it takes time for rock to be broken down and for the various plants to be able to establish stable populations. Secondary succession, on the other hand, happens when soil is already present. I want you to star that or highlight it in your notes, please. The presence of soil is the key way to differentiate between primary and secondary succession. So looking at secondary succession, this typically follows a disturbance, like a fire or a flood. If you're following the news right now, the fires taking place in Hawaii, last year the fires on the West Coast, or even back to 2020 with the devastation that happened in Australia, these are all examples of a disturbance that will lead to secondary succession taking place. In secondary succession, pioneer species such as grass and small plants will recolonize the area, followed by intermediate species, and finally our climax community. Notice that with secondary succession, the pioneer species is typically grass or small plants. This process is quicker, spanning decades to centuries as opposed to millennia like in primary succession. And again, the reason for that is soil is already present. Our mosses and lichen do not have to come in and break down the bare rock to create soil. It's already present, so our pioneer species can be grass. I want to touch base on a couple of things. Did you notice that primary succession takes longer than secondary? Both types do result in larger, woodier plants and eventually a stable climax community. And this community is the end point of succession. So succession ends with the climax community where the ecosystem finds balance. Another thing I want to point out is that the size of roots plays a role in succession. For instance, with primary succession, we discussed that our pioneer species, such as moss and lichens, are going to come in and they're going to attach to the bare rock, and then over time, they'll break down that rock to create soil. The reason grass and our small plants are next to establish is because of the size of their roots. Look how thin the grass's roots are. So they're able to live in small, shallow soil. As we go up to our intermediate species, we have a shrub here, and you can see it has much larger, developed, more complex root systems. And then eventually our large trees and how complex their root systems are, that's going to need a lot more soil present in order to create a stable ecosystem. I'm going to place this diagram here and ask you to keep in mind the difference between primary and secondary succession. Having a diagram or list in your notes will help you distinguish between the two types of succession. So again, pause here if you need to. Make sure that you have the different stages of succession in your notes for both primary and secondary so you can memorize and distinguish between the two. All right, and that wraps up our discussion for today on ecological levels of organization and succession. Remember, I will be more than happy to elaborate on any points in class. And to end on a light note, here's a succession-themed joke for you. I would tell you succession jokes, but you wouldn't like it. All right, stay curious. I look forward to diving deeper into ecology with you in our next lesson where we cover ecological relationships. See you guys in class.